Imagine a world without writing. A world without books, without street signs, without websites, without even a simple birthday card. A world where every single piece of information, every story, every law, every family history, had to be stored in the one place it could exist: human memory. For the vast majority of human history, this wasn't a thought experiment. It was reality. But humanity was on the verge of one of the most profound inventions of all time, a technology that would fundamentally reshape our minds, our societies, and our world. This is the story of that invention. This is the story of writing. What do a clay tablet from ancient Iraq, a delicate papyrus scroll from Egypt, and a glowing screen in the palm of your hand all have in common? They are all vessels for humankind's greatest magic trick: the ability to capture spoken words, to freeze fleeting thoughts in time, and to send them across vast distances and even across the gulf of death itself. Think about it. Through writing, we can listen to the musings of a Roman philosopher who lived 2,000 years ago. We can follow the laws of a Babylonian king who has been dust for millennia. We can build empires, share complex scientific discoveries, and peer into the very souls of people we will never meet. Writing is far more than just a collection of symbols. It's the operating system for human civilization. It's a technology that so completely surrounds us, we often forget it had to be invented. And the journey of that invention is one of the most incredible epics in our shared history. We're going to trace that path from the very first mysterious marks scratched onto bone, all the way to the global, digital web that connects billions of us today. Before we can understand the revolution of writing, we have to immerse ourselves in the world that existed before it, the world of the spoken word. For tens of thousands of years, humanity thrived in purely oral cultures. In this world, memory wasn't just a useful skill, it was a pillar of society. Your mind was the only library, the only hard drive, the only record book that existed. History wasn't something you read, it was something you recited. A contract wasn't something you signed, it was a promise witnessed by others and sealed in shared memory. The weight of this responsibility was immense. The collective knowledge of an entire tribe or nation, its genealogy, its sacred myths, its legal precedents, its practical knowledge of hunting and farming, all of it had to be passed down, perfectly, from one generation to the next. A single break in that chain, a single forgotten verse or story, could mean that a piece of their world was lost forever. To manage this incredible burden, these cultures developed specialized roles for individuals with prodigious memories. These were the living libraries of their time. In ancient Greece, before the Iliad and the Odyssey were ever written down, they were performed by epic poets known as bards, who would recite tens, oft thousands of lines of verse from memory, captivating audiences and preserving Greek identity and values. In ancient India, the sacred Vedic texts, the foundation of Hinduism, were transmitted orally for over 1,000 years by Brahmin priests. They developed astonishingly complex memorization techniques, ensuring that every syllable of these holy scriptures was passed on without error. In West Africa, the griot was, and in many places still is, a historian, a storyteller, a praise singer, a genealogist, and a living archive for their people. The griot's mind holds the epic poems, the family lineages, and the political histories of their community, a sacred trust passed from father to son or mother to daughter. But even with these memory masters, oral cultures needed tools to jog the memory, physical objects to anchor abstract information. These systems, known as mnemonics, were the crucial bridge between pure memory and true writing. They weren't writing as we know it. They couldn't record the full richness of spoken language, but they could store data. Among the Iroquois and other Native American nations of the Northeast, they used wampum, intricate belts and strings woven with beads made from purple and white shells. These were not simply beautiful decorations or a form of currency. Each belt was a record. The patterns, the colors, and the figures woven into the wampum represented the terms of a treaty, a historical event, or a sacred story. When a treaty was agreed upon, a wampum belt would be exchanged, and the keeper of the wampum would be tasked with reading the belt, reciting the agreement aloud to ensure its terms were never forgotten. The belt itself was a powerful physical reminder, a tangible piece of the past. Perhaps the most famous and enigmatic of these mnemonic systems comes from the Andes, from the vast and sophisticated Inca Empire. The Incas managed a sprawling, complex state without a single character of writing. Their solution was the quipu. A quipu consists of a main chord from which dozens, sometimes hundreds, of smaller, knotted strings hang. It was, in essence, a three-dimensional spreadsheet. The type of knot, its position on the string, the color of the string, and the way the strings were plied together all encoded information. We know for certain that the quipu was a brilliant accounting tool. Scribes known as quipucamaics, or knot keepers, used them to record census data, the amount of grain in a storehouse, the number of llamas in a herd, and the complex tribute owed to the state. It was the backbone of the Inca economy. But the question that still tantalizes archaeologists and historians is, could the quipu do more? Some Spanish chroniclers hinted that quipus could also record histories, poems, and biographies. The debate rages on, but the possibility that this intricate system of knots held narratives, not just numbers, is a powerful testament to human ingenuity. A more widespread and simpler tool was the tally stick. Used for centuries across Europe and other parts of the world, it was a brilliantly simple way to record debts and agreements. A stick would be marked with a series of notches representing a quantity or an amount owed. Then the stick was split in half lengthwise, with the debtor taking one half and the creditor the other. Because the notches and the wood's grain were unique, the two halves would match perfectly. It was a tamper-proof contract. Neither party could alter the notches without it being immediately obvious when the two halves were brought back together. This humble stick was a trusted record keeper long before written ledgers became common. Wampum, quipu, tally sticks, these were the first steps. They showed that it was possible to store information outside the human brain. But they were still limited. They could record how many, but not why, how, or who in detail. For that, humanity would need to take another leap. The world was changing. Around 10,000 BCE, humanity began a slow but profound transformation known as the Neolithic Revolution. We started shifting from nomadic hunting and gathering to a settled life of farming and herding. This was arguably the single most important change in the human story. For the first time, we could produce a surplus of food. This surplus allowed villages to grow into towns, and towns into the first bustling cities. With surplus came trade. With cities came social hierarchy, priests, rulers, craftsmen, and farmers. And with all of this came a brand new, overwhelming problem: complexity. As long as you're living in a small band, memory works just fine. You know who owes you a favor. You remember who's who. But what happens when you're a priest in a temple in a city like Uruk in Mesopotamia, with thousands of inhabitants? You're responsible for tracking offerings of grain, beer, and livestock from hundreds of different families. You need to manage rations for temple workers. You need to keep track of goods being traded with distant towns. The human brain's RAM was suddenly overloaded. Memory was no longer enough. The pressure was on to find a new, more reliable system for storing information. This pressure was the crucible in which writing was forged. This is where we see the first glimmer of true writing in what we call proto-writing. These are systems of symbols that can convey specific, limited information, but can't yet represent the full range of spoken language. They are the crucial missing link between the mnemonic devices of the oral age and the true writing systems that would follow. One of the most tantalizing and controversial examples comes from southeastern Europe, from a Neolithic society known as the Vinca culture, which flourished between the 6th and 5th millennia BC. Archaeologists have unearthed thousands of ceramic artifacts, figurines, pots, and spindles, inscribed with a collection of enigmatic symbols. The most famous of these are the Tartaria tablets, 3 small, unbaked clay tablets discovered in Romania. The symbols on them, a mix of abstract signs like crosses and chevrons, and more pictorial ones, like a horned animal, are arranged in rows, giving them the tantalizing appearance of a script. Could this be the world's first writing system, predating the famous scripts of Mesopotamia and Egypt by more than 1,000 years? The scholarly world is deeply divided. Some argue that yes, this is a rudimentary form of writing. Others maintain the symbols are more likely religious iconography, owner's marks, or simple decoration. Because we have so few examples and no way to decipher them, the Vinca symbols remain one of history's great mysteries, a silent whisper from our deep past. But while the Vinca story remains a question mark, the path to writing in Mesopotamia is stunningly clear. It's a story we can reconstruct step by step, and it begins not with pen and paper, but with little pieces of clay. Starting as early as 8000 BC in the ancient Near East, people used a system of small clay objects called tokens for accounting. It was a brilliantly simple system of 3D representation. A small clay cone might represent a small measure of grain. A sphere might represent a larger measure. A disc with a cross on it might stand for a sheep. For thousands of years, this system was enough to manage the simple economy of agricultural villages. As cities grew, the system evolved. New, more complex token shapes emerged, some with incisions and patterns, representing more refined goods like jars of oil, woven textiles, or loaves of bread. These were, in essence, a physical vocabulary of the commodities that fueled Mesopotamian life. The next step in the journey was a stroke of administrative genius. Imagine you're a merchant sending a shipment of 10 sheep and 5 jars of oil to a neighboring city. You send the goods with a shepherd. How does the recipient know they received the correct amount? How do you prevent the shepherd from helping himself to a sheep along the way? The solution was the bulla, a hollow clay ball, like a clay envelope. The merchant would place the tokens representing the shipment, 10 sheep tokens and 5 oil jar tokens, inside the bulla and seal it. The recipient would receive the shipment, break open the bulla, and check the tokens against the goods. It was a tamper-proof bill of lading. But this system had an obvious drawback. To check the contents, you had to destroy the envelope. And that's when some forgotten Sumerian accountant had the breakthrough idea. Before sealing the tokens inside the bulla, they started pressing the tokens into the soft clay on the outside. That way, you could read the contents of the bulla without breaking it. You could see the impressions of 10 sheep tokens and 5 oil jar tokens right there on the surface. And this, right here, is the moment the world changes. This is the critical leap. Some brilliant individual, whose name is lost to history, must have looked at these impressions on the outside of a bulla and had the ultimate moment. They realized, wait a minute, if the impressions are on the outside, why do we need the tokens on the inside at all? You could just take a flat piece of clay, a tablet, and use a stylus to draw the pictures of the tokens. The cone, the sphere, the disc with a cross. In that instant, accounting moved from 3 dimensions to 2. The physical representation of a thing was replaced by a symbolic representation of a thing. This was the birth of writing. The age of memory was ending, and the age of the written word was about to begin. The leap from drawing pictures of tokens on a clay tablet to a full-fledged writing system happened in the Fertile Crescent, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was Mesopotamia, a land we often call the cradle of civilization. And it was here, in the ancient land of Sumer, that history's first true writing system was born. By the end of the 4th millennium BC, Sumer was a collection of powerful, bustling city-states: Uruk, Ur, Lagash. These were not sleepy villages. They were complex urban centers with massive temples at their heart. These temples weren't just places of worship, they were the economic engines of the state. They owned vast tracts of land, employed thousands of people, and managed an intricate economy of grain, livestock, beer, and textiles. This incredible complexity created an administrative nightmare. The system of drawing simple pictures of goods was a good start, but it was quickly becoming inadequate. The temple administrators of Sumer needed something more. The earliest Sumerian writing was, as we saw, purely pictographic. The scribe would take a wet clay tablet and, using a pointed stylus, draw a picture of the object they were recording. A drawing of a head of an ox meant ox. A picture of a stalk of barley meant barley. It was simple, intuitive, and worked well for tangible objects. But this system had a very low ceiling. How do you draw a picture of love? How do you depict an abstract concept like enmity or fate? More practically, how do you write down someone's name? You can't draw a picture of Bob. This was the wall that pictographic writing inevitably hit. The solution that the Sumerian scribes invented was one of the most brilliant intellectual leaps in human history. It's what separates proto-writing from true writing. They developed the rebus principle. A rebus is a puzzle where you use pictures to represent sounds. For example, in English, you could draw a picture of a bee and a picture of a leaf to represent the word belief. The Sumerians did the same thing. Here's a classic example. The Sumerian word for arrow was ti. The word for life was til. Now, you can easily draw an arrow, but drawing life is nearly impossible. So, some Sumerian genius realized that since ti, arrow, and the sound ti, in til, life, were identical, they could use the simple, easy-to-draw picture of an arrow to represent not the object of an arrow, but the sound ti. This was the ta moment. The sign was liberated from the object it depicted and was now free to represent a syllable of sound. Suddenly, they could write anything they could say. They could spell out names, abstract ideas, and full grammatical sentences. Writing could now truly mirror spoken language. At the same time this conceptual revolution was happening, a practical, stylistic evolution was also taking place. Drawing curved, detailed pictures in soft, wet clay is a slow and messy business. The clay bunches up and the lines aren't clean. Scribes, being practical people who valued efficiency, developed a new technique. Instead of drawing lines, they began using a stylus made from a reed with a triangular or wedge-shaped tip. They would simply press this tip into the clay to make an impression. A vertical wedge, a horizontal wedge, a corner wedge. By combining these simple shapes, they could form any sign they needed, and they could do it much faster and more cleanly. This new style of writing is what we call cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. Over a few centuries, the old, realistic pictograms became completely stylized, transformed into abstract patterns of wedges. A picture of a human head, for instance, evolved into a cluster of about 10 wedge marks that, to our eyes, bear no resemblance to the original image. This was the world's first fully functional, efficient writing system. And what a powerful system it was. Cuneiform was so successful that it lasted for over 3,000 years. It was adopted and adapted by a succession of civilizations that dominated Mesopotamia. The Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who conquered the Sumerians, adapted cuneiform to write their own language. This was a tricky process, as Akkadian and Sumerian were as different as English and Chinese. Later, the Babylonians and Assyrians did the same. The script even spread to their neighbors, the Hittites, and Indo-European people in Anatolia, and was adapted by the Persians for their own inscriptions. Cuneiform became the international script of the ancient Near East. Thanks to the durability of clay, we have hundreds of thousands of these cuneiform tablets today. And what they tell us is breathtaking. Yes, many are administrative records, the humdrum accounting that started it all. But writing quickly overflowed its original purpose. On these clay tablets, we find the Epic of Gilgamesh, humanity's first great work of literature, a profound story of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. We find the Code of Hammurabi, one of the earliest and most complete legal codes, giving us an unparalleled window into Babylonian society. We find the Amarna letters, a trove of diplomatic correspondence between the pharaohs of Egypt and the kings of the Near East, revealing a complex web of international politics, trade, and royal marriages. And we find sophisticated astronomical diaries, mathematical texts that use a base 60 system. The reason we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle, medical texts, and even school tablets where apprentice scribes practiced their letters. The word, once etched in clay, had unlocked the universe. But just like the civilizations that used it, cuneiform eventually faded away. It was gradually replaced by simpler alphabetic scripts. By the 1st century AD, the knowledge of how to read these wedge-shaped signs was completely lost. For nearly 2,000 years, the tablets were silent. The challenge of making them speak again fell to a handful of brilliant and daring 19th century scholars. The key to cracking the code lay high on a remote limestone cliff face in modern-day Iran. This is the Behistun inscription. Carved around 500 BCE by order of the Persian king Darius the Great, it's a massive inscription proclaiming his victories. Crucially, it was written in 3 different languages, all using cuneiform script: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. It was in essence a cuneiform Rosetta Stone. The problem was, it was located hundreds of feet up a sheer cliff. Enter Sir Henry Rawlinson, a British Army officer and adventurer. Over several years in the 1830s and 40s, Rawlinson risked his life, dangling from ropes or balancing on a narrow ledge, to painstakingly transcribe the inscriptions. He started with the Old Persian text, which was the simplest. By identifying the names of kings mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus, he was able to slowly assign phonetic values to the signs. Once he had deciphered Old Persian, he used that knowledge as a key to unlock the other 2, far more complex languages. It was a monumental achievement of intellectual detective work. Thanks to Rawlinson and others, the voices of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon, silent for so long, could finally be heard again. At roughly the same time that writing was taking shape in the clay fields of Mesopotamia, another great civilization, down in the valley of the Nile River, was developing its own unique solution to the problem of capturing language. This was ancient Egypt, and its script, the beautiful and mysterious hieroglyphs, would become one of the most iconic and enduring writing systems in human history. For years, scholars debated whether the idea of writing was borrowed by Egypt from Mesopotamia or if it was an independent invention. The jury is still somewhat out, but most now lean towards independent invention, spurred by the knowledge that writing was possible. The context of the 2 scripts is certainly worlds apart. In Sumer, writing was born from the practical, bureaucratic needs of temple accountants. Its medium was humble clay. In Egypt, writing seems to have been born from the needs of kings and priests to commemorate names, victories, and religious doctrines. Its primary medium was monumental stone. From the very beginning, Egyptian writing was imbued with a sense of permanence, magic, and sacred power. The Greeks would later call it hieroglyphica, or sacred carvings. To an untrained eye, Egyptian hieroglyphs look like a simple form of picture writing. You can clearly see birds, snakes, human figures, and everyday objects. But this appearance is deceptive. Hieroglyphs are a far more complex and sophisticated system, a clever hybrid of different principles. There are 3 types of signs working together. First, there are logograms, where a sign represents a whole word. A picture of the sun could indeed mean sun. A picture of a leg could mean leg. This is the straightforward pictographic part. Second, and most importantly, there are phonograms, where a sign represents a sound. This is similar to the Sumerian system, but with a twist. Egyptian phonograms represented only consonants. They had signs for a single consonant, like our letters B or T, signs for a combination of 2 consonants, and even signs for 3. The vowels were simply omitted from the written script and had to be supplied by the reader based on context and their knowledge of the language. Third, there are determinatives. These are the secret key to reading hieroglyphs. They are silent signs, placed at the end of a word, that give the reader a clue to the word's general category or meaning. For example, after spelling out a man's name phonetically, the scribe would add a small picture of a seated man. After a word meaning to walk or to run, they would add a picture of a pair of walking legs. After the name of a god, they would add a symbol of a seated, bearded figure. These determinatives were crucial for avoiding ambiguity in a script that didn't write vowels. They helped the reader determine if the consonants SN were meant to be read as sin, brother, or senu, to pass by. Just like in Mesopotamia, the formal, monumental script wasn't suitable for all occasions. Carving beautiful hieroglyphs into a temple wall is one thing, writing a quick laundry list or a letter is another. So, the Egyptians developed cursive forms of their script. The most important was hieratic, or priestly, script. This was a simplified, flowing version of the hieroglyphs that could be written quickly on papyrus with a reed brush and ink. If hieroglyphs are like formal block printing, hieratic is like everyday cursive handwriting. For most of Egypt's history, hieratic was the script used for literature, administration, and personal letters. Later still, in the first millennium BC, an even more abbreviated and faster script called demotic, or popular script, emerged for everyday use. For 3,000 years, these scripts were the lifeblood of Egyptian civilization. But as Egypt's power waned and it was conquered by a succession of foreign powers, Persians, Greeks, and finally Romans, the ancient scripts began to fall into disuse. With the spread of Christianity, the Coptic alphabet, a derivative of the Greek alphabet, replaced the old scripts. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 AD. After that, the knowledge of how to read the sacred carvings vanished completely. For the next 1,400 years, the intricate signs on Egypt's temples and papyri were a total mystery. European scholars and travelers were fascinated by them, but their attempts at decipherment were based on a false premise. They believed the hieroglyphs were not a functional writing system but a purely symbolic and mystical code, where each picture represented a complex philosophical idea. The German scholar Athanasius Kircher, for example, famously translated a simple royal name as a convoluted esoteric sentence. They were on the completely wrong track. The key that would finally unlock this ancient world was a slab of black stone, unearthed by accident in 1799 by French soldiers in Napoleon's army near the Egyptian town of Rashid, which the Europeans called Rosetta. The Rosetta Stone was a royal decree from the time of Ptolemy V, around 196 BC. What made it priceless was that the same decree was inscribed on it in 3 different scripts: formal hieroglyphs at the top, everyday demotic in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom. Here, at last, was a potential key. The stone became a sensation, and the race to decipher it began. The breakthrough would ultimately be made by a brilliant young French linguist named Jean-François Champollion. Champollion was obsessed with ancient Egypt from a young age and had mastered numerous ancient languages, including Coptic, the latest form of the Egyptian language. He devoted his life to cracking the hieroglyphic code. He started, as others had, with the royal names, which he correctly assumed would be enclosed in the oval rings we now call cartouches. On the Rosetta Stone, he located the cartouche containing the name of Ptolemy, which he knew from the Greek text. But the real breakthrough came when he got a copy of an inscription that contained another cartouche, this one with the name of the famous queen, Cleopatra. Champollion had a flash of genius. He wrote the 2 names, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, out in hieroglyphs, one above the other. He knew that the 2 names shared several sounds in common: P, T, O, and L. By comparing the signs in the 2 cartouches, he could see which signs corresponded to which sounds. The lion sign in both names must be L. The square mat in both must be P. The half circle must be T. And so on. He had confirmed that at least some hieroglyphs were phonetic. They represented sounds, just like the letters of our alphabet. He then used his deep knowledge of Coptic to deduce the sounds of other signs, and slowly, painstakingly, the entire system began to reveal itself to him. In 1822, in a moment of euphoric realization, he famously burst into his brother's office, cried, "Tiens l'affaire! I've got it!" and promptly fainted from exhaustion. He had done it. He had cracked the code. The voice of the pharaohs, silent for nearly 1.5 millennia, could now speak to the world once more. The great writing systems of Mesopotamia and Egypt were monumental achievements. They allowed humanity to build complex states, record epic literature, and codify laws. But they had a fundamental problem. They were incredibly difficult to learn. Cuneiform and hieroglyphs each required the mastery of hundreds, if not thousands, of complex signs. Becoming a scribe was a full-time, years-long career. It meant that literacy was, by definition, the exclusive property of a tiny, highly trained elite. It was a specialized skill for priests, palace administrators, and professional scribes. For the average person, the farmer, the soldier, the craftsman, reading and writing were as inaccessible as the magic of the gods. Writing was a tool of power, and that power was held in very few hands. For writing to truly change the world, it had to be democratized. It had to be simplified. And that simplification, that stroke of pure genius, didn't happen in the grand capitals of Memphis or Babylon. It happened on the fringes, in the dusty deserts and bustling trade routes of the Sinai Peninsula and the land of Canaan, the territory we now know as the Levant. Around 1850 BCE, this area was a cultural melting pot. The mighty Egyptian empire controlled the region, operating turquoise mines deep in the Sinai desert. The workers in these mines were often Semitic-speaking people from Canaan. They were surrounded by the majesty and mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphs, carved onto temple walls and monuments. They saw the power of writing, but the Egyptian system was far too complex for them to learn. So, they invented their own. What these anonymous geniuses did was utterly revolutionary. They looked at the Egyptian pictures, but they ignored their complex meanings and phonetic values in the Egyptian language. Instead, they used the pictures in a radically simple way, based on a principle we now call acrophony. It works like this. You take a picture, say it in your own language, and then use that picture to represent only the very first sound of your word. Let's follow their logic. They saw the Egyptian hieroglyph for an ox. The word for ox in their West Semitic language was something like aleph. So, they decided to let the picture of the ox head represent not the whole word ox, but just its first sound, the subtle glottal stop at the beginning of the word. They saw the hieroglyph for a house. Their word for house was bait. So, the simple drawing of a house plan became the sign for the b sound. The picture of water, mayim, became the sign for the m sound. They did this for about 24 signs, creating a small, manageable set of characters where each one stood for a single, basic sound, specifically a single consonant. This was it. This was the birth of the alphabet. In one brilliant move, they had slashed the barrier to entry for literacy. You no longer needed to memorize hundreds of pictograms or complex syllabic signs. All you needed to learn were about 24 simple letters and the sounds they represented. It was the ultimate simplification, an invention born from necessity on the frontiers of empire. This early alphabet, known as Proto-Sinaitic or Proto-Canaanite, was the common ancestor of almost every alphabet in use today. But it was still a bit rough around the edges. The task of refining it, standardizing it, and spreading it to the world fell to one of the ancient world's most remarkable peoples, the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, based in a series of powerful city-states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos on the coast of modern-day Lebanon, were the master mariners and merchants of their time. Their cedarwood ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, creating a vast trading network that stretched from the Near East to the shores of Spain and beyond. They were intensely practical people. They didn't have time for a cumbersome, artistic script. They needed something fast, lean, and efficient for their contracts, their ledgers, and their correspondence. Around 1050 BCE, they had perfected the alphabet. They streamlined the Proto-Canaanite characters into a sleek, standardized system of 22 letters. Like its ancestor, the Phoenician alphabet was consonantal. It had no letters for vowels. A writer would simply spell out the consonant backbone of a word, and the reader, a native speaker, would know which vowels to insert based on the context. It's similar to how we might write building for building or message for message in a text today. For Semitic languages like Phoenician, where the root meaning of a word is carried by its consonants, this system worked remarkably well. And as the Phoenicians sailed the seas, they took their greatest invention with them. Their alphabet was even more valuable than their famous purple dye or their sturdy cedar logs. Wherever they established a trading post or a colony, in Cyprus, in Carthage, in Sicily, in Spain, they introduced their simple, elegant writing system. They planted the seeds of the alphabet all around the Mediterranean, and from those seeds, new and powerful forms of writing would begin to grow. Around the 9th century BCE, the Phoenician alphabet arrived in Greece. The Greeks, an equally vibrant and curious seafaring people, quickly saw the power of this new tool. They adopted the Phoenician letters, but they immediately ran into a problem. The Greek language is part of the Indo-European family, and unlike Semitic languages, vowels are not optional in Greek. They are absolutely critical to a word's meaning. The words patris, fatherland, petros, rocks, and pytros, clay pot, are distinguished only by their vowels. A consonant-only script was simply not going to work. The solution the Greeks devised was the second great stroke of genius in the alphabet story. They looked at the 22 Phoenician letters and noticed that several of them represented guttural consonant sounds that simply didn't exist in the Greek language. To a Greek speaker, these letters were useless. But instead of throwing them away, they repurposed them. In a moment of pure inspiration, they assigned these extra letters to their vowel sounds. The Phoenician letter Aleph, which stood for a glottal stop sound the Greeks didn't have, was transformed into the letter Alpha to represent the vowel sound. The Phoenician He, another soft consonant, became Epsilon for the sound. The letter Ayin, a deep pharyngeal consonant, was repurposed as Omicron for the sound. And so on. They also added a few new letters for sounds they needed. This was the final, crucial step. By creating distinct symbols for both consonants and vowels, the Greeks had invented the world's first true alphabet. It was a complete phonetic toolkit that could precisely record the full range of spoken language. The consequences of this invention were cataclysmic. This new alphabet, with only about 24 letters to learn, was incredibly easy. For the first time in history, literacy was no longer the exclusive domain of a priestly or scribal class. A reasonably intelligent person could learn to read and write in a matter of weeks. This democratization of literacy unleashed a cultural explosion. It fueled the golden age of Greece. Suddenly, complex ideas could be written down, circulated, debated, and built upon. It was the dawn of philosophy, as thinkers like Plato and Aristotle could record their dialogues. It was the birth of theater, as playwrights like Sophocles and Euripides wrote down their scripts. It was the beginning of history, as Herodotus and Thucydides recorded the events of their time for posterity. It was the engine of science and mathematics. This simple, efficient script provided the foundation for Western thought. From Greece, the alphabet continued its journey westward. Greek colonists brought their writing system to southern Italy, where it was picked up by a powerful and enigmatic people called the Etruscans, who dominated central Italy. And from the Etruscans, the alphabet was passed on to a small, ambitious city-state on the banks of the Tiber River, Rome. The Romans adapted the Etruscan version of the alphabet to fit their own Latin language. They dropped some letters and modified the shapes of others, eventually standardizing the 26 letters that many of us use to this day. They perfected the elegant, monumental capital letters we see carved into their awe-inspiring architecture: the Roman Forum, the Colosseum, the triumphal arches. The Latin alphabet became a symbol of Roman power and order. And as the Roman legions marched, conquering a vast empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, they brought their engineering, their laws, and their language with them. And with their language, they brought their script. The Latin alphabet became the administrative script of Western Europe. Even after the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century AD, the alphabet survived and thrived. It was preserved by the Christian Church, which used Latin as its official language. In the quiet scriptoria of monasteries across Europe, from Ireland to Germany, monks painstakingly copied religious texts, philosophical treatises, and classical literature, keeping the flame of literacy alive through the so-called Dark Ages. It was during this medieval period that writing took another huge leap in usability. Early scripts were often written in all caps with no spaces between words, a style called scriptio continua. Reading was a slow process of deciphering a continuous string of letters. But under the reign of the Emperor Charlemagne around 800 AD, a new style called Carolingian minuscule was developed. It introduced a host of innovations we now take for granted: clear, rounded lowercase letters, spaces between words, and the beginnings of a punctuation system. These changes made texts dramatically faster and easier to read, further broadening the reach of the written word. While the Latin alphabet was conquering Western Europe, other descendants of that first Semitic script were spreading east, creating their own rich traditions. The Phoenician alphabet had a sister script, Aramaic, which was so successful it became the lingua franca, the international language of diplomacy and trade, for the entire Near East. It was the official language of the mighty Persian Empire. And as it spread, Aramaic became the mother of a vast family of scripts that would stretch from the Mediterranean to India. Two of its most important descendants are the Hebrew and Arabic alphabets. The Hebrew square script, as we know it today, developed from Aramaic around the 3rd century BCE. Like its ancestors, it is written from right to left and is primarily consonantal. For centuries, sacred texts like the Torah were written with consonants only. To ensure that these holy scriptures were read and pronounced with absolute precision, medieval Jewish scholars known as the Masoretes developed a system of dots and dashes called nikud, which are placed above or below the letters to indicate the correct vowels. The elegant, flowing Arabic script also evolved from Aramaic, via a script used by the Nabateans, the desert traders who built the magnificent city of Petra. The explosive spread of the Arabic alphabet is inextricably linked to the rise of Islam in the 7th century AD. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, was recorded in this script, and as the religion spread from the Arabian Peninsula, the script went with it. A key feature of Arabic is its cursive nature, where most letters connect to one another in a fluid line. In the Islamic world, where figurative art was often discouraged, calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, was elevated to the highest form of artistic expression, used to adorn mosques, books, and palaces. Meanwhile, a completely different branch was sprouting from the Greek alphabet. In the 9th century AD, the Byzantine Empire sought to spread Orthodox Christianity to the Slavic peoples of Eastern Europe. Two missionary brothers, Saint Cyril and Methodius, were sent north for this task. They faced a significant linguistic challenge. The Slavic languages they encountered had a whole range of sounds that did not exist in Greek. A direct translation of the Bible using the Greek alphabet would have been imprecise and awkward. So, Cyril, a brilliant linguist, undertook a monumental task. He created a new alphabet tailored specifically to the sounds of the Slavic tongue. The first version was a complex and highly original script called Glagolitic. This was later simplified and revised by his followers into the alphabet we now know as Cyrillic, named in his honor. The Cyrillic alphabet was based largely on Greek capital letters, but Cyril ingeniously added about a dozen new letters to represent the unique Slavic sounds, like for the SH sound or for the ZH sound. It was a masterwork of linguistic engineering, a perfect tool that allowed the Slavic world to develop its own rich literary tradition, and it is used today by hundreds of millions of people across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. From one ancient source on the Sinai Peninsula, the idea of the alphabet had branched out, adapted, and blossomed, giving a written voice to countless cultures across the globe. While the alphabet was beginning its long march across the Western world, an entirely different story of writing was unfolding in the East. In the fertile basin of the Yellow River, another of the world's great civilizations was taking its first steps, and it would create a writing system that was utterly unique, profoundly influential, and just as successful as the alphabet, though in a completely different way. The writing of China was one of history's very few truly independent inventions, a testament to a different kind of genius. Our earliest glimpse of this system comes from around 1250 BCE, during the Shang dynasty. It comes to us not on clay or stone, but on bone. These are the famous oracle bones. When the Shang kings or their diviners sought answers from their ancestors or deities, they would perform a ritual of pyromancy. A question, perhaps, will the coming harvest be bountiful? Or, should the king go to war with the neighboring tribe? Was meticulously inscribed onto a turtle's plastron, the flat underside of its shell, or an ox's scapula, the shoulder blade. The bone was then heated with a hot poker until it cracked. A specialist diviner would then read the pattern of the cracks to interpret the divine answer. For us, the true miracle is not in the cracks, but in the questions. These inscriptions, known as Jiaguan, are the ancestors of all modern Chinese characters. From the very beginning, Chinese writing was on a different evolutionary track. It never made the leap to a purely phonetic, alphabetic system. Instead, it evolved as a logographic system, where each character represents a word or a single unit of meaning, a morpheme. It's a system built on meaning first, sound second. The earliest characters were simple pictograms, direct drawings of the things they represented. The character for a person, ren, is a simple sketch of a walking figure. The character for a tree, mu, is a clear depiction of a trunk with branches. But like all pictographic systems, this had its limits. So, the ancient Chinese scribes developed more sophisticated principles. They created ideograms to represent abstract ideas. Sometimes this was done by adding an indicator to a pictogram. The character for root or origin, ben, is simply the tree character with a horizontal stroke across its base. More often, they combined pictograms to create a new meaning. The character for bright, Ming, is a brilliant combination of the two brightest things in the sky, the sun and the moon. But the real engine of the Chinese writing system, the principle that allowed it to grow into a script capable of expressing any thought, is the phonosemantic compound. Over 80% of all Chinese characters are of this type. These are brilliant, two-part characters. One part, the radical or key, gives a hint about the character's meaning. The other part, the phonetic component, gives a hint about its pronunciation. Let's look at the example of the character for river. It's made of two parts. On the left is the radical, which is a compressed version of the character for water. This tells you the character has something to do with water. On the right is the character, which is pronounced ka. It doesn't mean anything in this context. It's just there to tell you that the new character is also pronounced in a similar way. This elegant combination of semantic clue and phonetic clue allowed the Chinese to create thousands of new characters for their rich and growing vocabulary. This unique system has had profound consequences. On the one hand, its great disadvantage is its sheer difficulty. To achieve basic literacy in Chinese, one must memorize thousands of individual characters, a far greater task than learning the 26 letters of the English alphabet. This has historically been a significant barrier to mass literacy. But on the other hand, the logographic system has been China's greatest unifying force. China is a country as linguistically diverse as Europe. A person from Beijing speaking Mandarin and a person from Guangzhou speaking Cantonese cannot understand each other's spoken language. They are mutually unintelligible, but they can both read the exact same newspaper. Because the characters represent meaning, not just sound, the written language transcends the differences in pronunciation. For over 2,000 years, this shared script has been the cultural glue holding the vast Chinese civilization together, creating a sense of shared identity that has weathered dynasties, invasions, and revolutions. Furthermore, in Chinese culture, writing is not merely a tool for communication, it is one of the highest art forms. Calligraphy, the art of writing with a brush and ink, is revered alongside painting. The four treasures of the study, the brush, the ink, the paper, and the inkstone, are the essential tools of the scholar and artist. The skill of the calligrapher is judged not just on the technical correctness of the characters, but on the life, energy, and spirit embedded in their strokes. Each character becomes a dance of ink on paper, an expression of the writer's inner world. The immense cultural gravity of China meant that its writing system spread to all its neighbors, including Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. But for these countries, whose languages were structurally nothing like Chinese, adopting this script presented an enormous challenge. Their solutions to this challenge are a masterclass in linguistic adaptation and invention. The story in Japan begins around the 5th century AD, when the Japanese began to adopt Chinese culture and, with it, its writing system. The problem was immediate and severe. Chinese is an isolating language, with a fairly simple grammar where one character generally corresponds to one syllable and one word. Japanese, in contrast, is an agglutinative language with long, complex words made up of a root to which multiple grammatical elements, like verb endings and particles, are attached. Trying to write the complexities of Japanese grammar using only Chinese characters, which the Japanese call kanji, was like trying to solve a complex equation with the wrong tools. It was clumsy and incredibly inefficient. For centuries, the Japanese struggled with this problem. Then they devised a brilliant solution. They didn't abandon the powerful kanji, which were perfect for conveying core meanings of nouns and verb stems. Instead, they invented their own, purely phonetic scripts to handle the grammatical parts of their language. These scripts are called kana. They were created by drastically simplifying existing Chinese characters. And they came in two forms. The first is hiragana. Created by simplifying the cursive forms of whole kanji, Hiragana is a flowing, rounded script. It became the primary tool for writing all the grammatical bits that kanji couldn't handle: verb endings, particles, and native Japanese words that had no kanji equivalent. The second is katakana. Created by taking small parts of more complex kanji, katakana is an angular, distinct script. It was assigned a specific set of tasks, primarily to write foreign loanwords, like the Japanese words for computer or ice cream, the names of foreign people and places, scientific terms, and for emphasis, much like we use italics. The result is the unique hybrid system that is modern Japanese writing. A typical sentence is a beautiful and complex tapestry woven from all three scripts: the meaning-heavy kanji, the grammatical glue of hiragana, and the occasional foreign flavor of katakana. It is a system that perfectly reflects Japan's history of borrowing from China and innovating to create a culture that is uniquely its own. The story in Korea followed a similar path, but with a dramatic, revolutionary twist. For over a millennium, the Korean elite used classical Chinese characters, which they call hanja, for all official and literary writing. This created a deep social divide. Hanja was incredibly difficult, and literacy was confined to the aristocracy, effectively excluding the common people and women from education and power. This situation troubled the great 15th century monarch, King Sejong the Great. A brilliant scholar and enlightened ruler, Sejong believed that his people deserved a writing system they could actually use. And so, in 1443, he and a commission of scholars did something unprecedented in the history of writing. They deliberately and scientifically invented an entirely new alphabet for the Korean people. It was called Hangul, meaning great script. Hangul is widely praised by linguists as perhaps the most perfect and logical writing system ever created. Its design is a marvel of phonetic science. The shapes of the consonant letters are not arbitrary. They are designed to be miniature diagrams of the human speech organs. For example, the letter for the K, or G sound, mimics the shape of the back of the tongue as it touches the roof of the mouth. The letter for the N sound represents the shape of the tip of the tongue touching the back of the teeth. The vowel letters are equally brilliant, based on a simple philosophical concept representing the three realms of the cosmos: a horizontal line, for the flat earth, a short stroke, originally a, for the sun in the heavens, and a vertical line, for the human who stands between them. All of the complex vowels in Korean are created by combining these three basic elements. King Sejong's goal was to create an alphabet so simple that a common person could learn it in days. Initially, the male, Confucian-educated elite scoffed at Hangul, calling it Amkyo, women's script, and continuing to use their prestigious hanja. But the people's alphabet could not be suppressed. Over the centuries, it grew in popularity, and in the 20th century, it became the official script of Korea, a profound source of national pride and one of the world's most impressive literacy success stories. A third great tradition of writing flowed out of the Indian subcontinent, creating a breathtaking diversity of scripts that now dominate a vast swath of Asia, from Tibet to Thailand. At the head of this massive family stands an ancient script called Brahmi. First appearing around the 3rd century BCE, Brahmi is believed to be another descendant of the Aramaic script, brought to India through the trade and cultural connections of the Persian Empire. This makes it a distant cousin of the Hebrew, Arabic, and Greek alphabets. But while its ultimate origin may be Semitic, the Brahmi script and its descendants operate on a unique principle that is a brilliant hybrid of an alphabet and a syllabary. This system is called an abugida. Here's how it works. In an abugida, each main character represents a consonant that has an inherent, default vowel sound, usually the short sound. Let's take the example of Devanagari, the script used to write Hindi and Sanskrit. The base character is not just the sound K, it is the full syllable Ka. If you want to write a different syllable, like ki, ku, or hiku, you don't write a new letter for the vowel. Instead, you add a small diacritical mark, a hook, a curl, or a line, to the base consonant. So, to write ki, you add the marked to gets. This system is incredibly efficient for Indian languages, which have a large number of consonant sounds but a relatively standard set of vowels. From its ancient source in Brahmi, the Abugida principle spread and evolved, creating a dazzling visual array of different scripts, all sharing the same underlying logic. In North India, the strong, horizontal hanging line of Devanagari is dominant. To the east, the scripts of Bengali and Odia are full of flowing, circular forms. In the south, the Tamil and Telugu scripts are equally curvy and elegant. The principle traveled with Hinduism and Buddhism into Southeast Asia, giving rise to the angular, ornate scripts of Thai and Khmer, the looping forms of Burmese, and the stacked, blocky characters of the Tibetan alphabet. Each script is a work of art, a unique visual identity for its culture, yet all are united as branches of the great Brahmi family tree.